Toastmasters and guests, it is my pleasure to welcome International Director of Region 9, Distinguished Toastmaster Stefano McGee.
The average world citizen in 2020 speaks between 15,000 and 20,000 words a day. Yet few of us, even as Toastmasters, spend much time thinking about it. We go to school for 12, 15, 20 years, learning to read and write, to think and do math. But outside of Toastmasters, we've never been educated about the most critical skill we possess: how to speak and interact well with the people around us. As John will explain, since the days of ancient Greece until 3 centuries ago, the subject of speech and the deepest essence of education and the most highly emphasized aspect of education. What happened? Did speaking well become unimportant? Please welcome John Bowe.
Thank you very much, International Director McGee. The original plan was that we were going to be in Paris and we were going to be in the same room enjoying each other's presence. So by way of saying hello, and thank you very much for choosing my talk, I want to acknowledge my frustration with that, and I'm sure we're all feeling the same thing. Normal people obviously like to get into the same room and feel each other's presence as much as we do. But think about it, we're the only group in the world who gets together to be in the same room for the purpose of scrutinizing every aspect of our performance. So we enjoy each other's presence, but we also find it meaningful and interesting to break down the words we use, the way we use our face and our bodies and our voices to connect with other people. And this hobby of ours is absolutely unique in the modern world. So if you think about it, there are billions of people around the world going like this, and then there's us obsessing about how to have this full-on, best possible connection with other human beings. I'm here obviously because I wrote a book about this subject, but the reason I wrote the book about it was because I've come to believe that this thing we do is something of a superpower. It has the ability to teach us to give better presentations and speeches and stuff like that, but I also think it has something of a religious component to it in that it changes our lives and it saves us, but it also has the power to save the whole world. And I'll talk about that in parts 2 and 3 of my talk, but in part 1, I want to talk about how the ancient Greeks invented this thing we do called public speaking, because all of these big picture crazy religious notions about it come from them. And I think that that's fascinating. And the whole story of it is fascinating for a group of people obsessed with words and communication. But the main reason I want to talk about it is because the mental tools that they invented to help us connect with each other are, in my experience, hands down the most useful tools for a group of Toastmasters to add to our skill set. Once upon a time, there was no such thing as public speaking. In ancient Greece, in the 4th century BC, before the invention of democracy, regular people couldn't talk to crowds. So the rulers and the generals could talk to the masses, but for the rest of us, no. And then they invent democracy, so suddenly you have elections with lots of speeches. You have these public forums where people are haranguing each other and arguing about public policy. And then you have trials. And ancient trials in Greece consisted of the accuser and the accused squaring off against each other in court with no judge to serve as referee and no lawyers to represent them, and a jury of 200 to 1,500 drunk, jeering plebes. So what it really came down to was a public speaking contest. And your job was to entertain these crazy jurors. And never mind the evidence or lack of evidence. If you failed to entertain the jury, you were going to lose. So anybody could sue anybody for any reason. Someone could say that you insulted their mother and you ruined the family reputation, and now you owe them your flock of sheep or your family home. And they drag you into court, and if they're better at public speaking than you are, you lose. You lose everything you have because you're terrible at public speaking. And it becomes a wave of crime with fast talkers abusing the legal system all over Greece. So in 387 BC, a lawyer named Corax, who feels sorry for the bad public speakers, writes really what is the world's first primer in public speaking. And he advises regular everyday people when you have to go to court, here's where you stand, here's how you stand, here's when you talk, here's when you shut up, here's how to frame your case so that it makes sense. And it's the first time anybody in ancient Greece has taken a step back from the way that we talk in everyday life and suggested that there are good ways to do it and bad ways, and that it's an art. So in this era of democracy and free speech, where suddenly the ability to speak well is worth a lot of money, it sets off this gold rush of people rushing in to study the mysteries of speech. And so teachers and philosophers and all these people rush in to explore why, for example, stories and jokes work better when they're broken into 3 parts. They study all of the different logical devices you can use to defend yourself in an argument. They study the power of repetition and the power of using your voice in different ways, or yelling or speaking very quietly. They even come up with these weird hacks or tricks about verb tense. One of them is, if you want to punish somebody or blame them or heighten a sense of conflict, keep your conversation or your argument in the past tense. And if you want to escape blame or reduce the tension, shift to the future tense. You see this all the time in political debates, where a challenger is harassing an incumbent about their political record and say, you were in office for 20 years and you didn't do this and you didn't do this. So all of that is the past tense. And then you'll see the incumbent pivot and say, yeah, that's why I have this plan going forward to do blah, blah, blah. And you watch them go back and forth. Yeah, but in the past, you did this and this and this. Yes, but in the future, I'm going to do this and this. Now, I mentioned that these are these mental tools, and the power of them is labeling them and beginning to use them consciously. So I promise you, the next time someone's blaming you for not taking out the garbage or failing to live up to something, shift to the future. And if they try to get you back in the past, shift to the future again and watch what happens. And you'll realize, wow, these things are really meaningful. The title of this talk is Aristotle Was a Toastmaster. And of course, I'm joking, but my point is that if not for him and the book he wrote in 354 BC, the Ars Rhetorica, or the Art of Rhetoric, it's very possible we wouldn't be here today 2,500 years later. Aristotle's big idea was to dive beneath all of the behavior and stuff that we do when we communicate. So all the ways that we use our words and our voices and our bodies and our faces and everything, and sort of look down at the foundational thing that goes on when we communicate. And what he comes up with is that when we communicate, we are seeking to persuade, always, always, always. We want people to agree with us, to like us, to believe us. And so if you want to study how to use your voice or move your neck or do whatever you do when we study public speaking, you really need to look at these 3 essentially psychological principles. And he comes up with 3 major ones. So the first rule is the audience is the beginning and the end of public speaking. And what this means is exactly what it says. From your first thought until the bow you take when you're leaving stage, every single choice you make about a speech has to have your audience in mind. Now, if you compare that to modern ways of teaching public speaking, they talk about reducing your anxiety. They talk about increasing your confidence. You can take beta blockers, you can do relaxation exercises, you can imagine the audience naked. You can do these power poses that are supposed to trigger chemicals that will make you feel confident. And none of those things have anything to do with your audience. Aristotle's point is pretty obvious and pretty common sense. The public is the most important part of public speaking. Aristotle's second principle is that when we persuade people, we use 3 different tools: ethos, logos, and pathos. That's character, facts, and emotions. So facts are pretty easy. I think I'm right. I'm going to prove something to you. I'll show you the facts, and you will be persuaded. Emotion is also pretty easy. If I get you laughing or crying or feeling a certain way while you hear my facts, you'll be a little bit more disposed to agree with me. Ethos is a little bit more tricky, character. So what he means is character is me. When you're listening to me, it's what you know about me, what you've heard about me or read about me, but it's also the credibility I inspire as I explain whatever facts I'm explaining to you. So if I tell you that I'm going to talk for 10 minutes and I talk for 40 minutes, even if my facts are great, you're going to think there's something a little bit weird with John. Or if my glasses are sitting like this while I'm talking, you're going to think John's kind of a goofball. I don't know if he knows what he's talking about. And his point really is that these issues of personality and style are the most important part of persuasion. And for modern people who are obsessed with science and rationality, this is the least easy thing for us to digest. We cannot accept the fact that style and personality trump fact, and it drives us crazy. And even people who know it don't know it. And you see this in elections all the time. And his point is really just again and again, being smart and being right is not really the thing that persuades other people. Aristotle's third principle is the easiest to understand and implement, but for me, it was the hardest to understand. His book, The Ars Rhetorica, is just crystal clear. It's insanely clear. It's like a blueprint. And everything about it is perfect until he gets to this part in the middle where he goes off on this crazy detour about happiness. And he makes this list of all the things that make people happy, like health and love and family and wealth and reputation. And he goes into this great, super obvious detail about why these things make us happy. And I stared at that for about 3 years wondering, why is this in a book about how to speak better? Because it didn't make any sense. And finally, I understood his point, which is super simple. His point is, when you talk to people, you might be caring about whatever you're talking about, but what they're caring about is their own happiness. So whatever you're talking about, in the same way that you put the audience first and think about them first, you need to think about their happiness first. Why are you talking? You're not just talking to talk, you're talking for them to make them happy. And as simple as these 3 rules are, they have completely been forgotten. Obviously, none of this is rocket science, but you would think that it is because no one today knows these things, even though 2,500 years later, they are the 3 most helpful rules about public speaking I've ever heard. Earlier, I said that in parts 2 and 3 of this talk, I would explain how and why our little hobby here is something of a religion. There was a philosopher who lived at the same time as Aristotle named Socrates. And he believed that learning all of this stuff actually made you a better person. He said, while there's no art form, probably, that can instill a sense of justice or discernment, if there is such an art form, it's rhetoric. And what he believed was that all of this stuff I'm talking about thinking about other people, had a civilizing influence on us. And that if you go through the paces of thinking about your audience deeply, 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 thinking about what they want, thinking about their happiness, it would make you a better person. I can say from my own experience, this is absolutely true. When I was 10 years old, growing up in suburban Minneapolis, they had a thing on the radio called the Battle of the Bands. And it would run all weekend, and you would call in, and the phone would be busy, 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 and you would vote for your favorite bands. And at the end of the weekend, they would have this grand championship final battle of the bands. So I would call up, and the DJ would eventually answer the phone and say, hey, you're on the air, and you'd vote, and they'd hang up, and you'd hear yourself on the radio. So for the championship, it came down to Deep Purple versus John Denver. Deep Purple was this heavy metal band that's forgotten today, and John Denver is still pretty popular. But for me, I hated John Denver, and it was the most important thing in the world to me at that age to defeat John Denver. It was like the forces of evil were going to win if John Denver won the contest. So I call in for 2 hours. And finally, the DJ picks up the phone. He says, hey, you're on the air. Who do you vote for, John Denver or Deep Purple? And I froze. And I said, John Denver. And he hangs up. And a couple of seconds later, I hear my own 10-year-old voice on the radio saying, And in terms of speech anxiety, that's pretty much my life for the next 40 years. I'm just the guy. And there's a quote by our founder, Ralph C. Smedley, which I love. And I'm going to break every cardinal rule of public speaking by putting it up on the screen and also reading it at the same time. Because I imagine that as Toastmasters, every single one of us, men and women, can completely identify with what he expresses here. When a man is unable to express his thoughts to his fellows, to express himself vigorously and comfortably in his business and social life, he lives a diminished existence. The greater part of his intellect, his creativity, and his very being lay dormant. My speech anxiety, which I did not know was speech anxiety, interfered with every part of my life, my personal life, my professional life. I would write books, I would go on stage, I would talk very, very poorly about them. And it had the effect of making me a very alienated individual because there were huge parts of myself I couldn't share. And I would see other people able to share from their head and their heart and get stuff outside of them and share it with other humans. And I was very much on the outside of that. And I was jealous. And the best stuff that I had to share with people just stayed inside of me, and it made me alienated. So as you can see now here, I'm not the world's best public speaker, but what I have learned has enabled me to talk about these ideas, which are what I care about more than anything in the world. And in the past, I couldn't do that. So for me, it's a total transformation. I can be honest now, I can participate, I can show up. It's not just like I'm the same guy who can now do presentations. I'm a different guy. I can show you everything about me and participate in the most valuable things in life. From Aristotle's death, for the next 2,000 years, rhetoric remained the most intensely studied subject of all time. Up until the year 1600, there were more books published about rhetoric than any other subject except Christianity. Every single person who was lucky enough to get an education spent years learning everything that I'm talking about. There's nothing that I'm talking about that would have been news to them. And then 2 or 3 centuries ago, throughout the West, it just disappears. So one of my big revelations was people today talk as much as they ever did talk, and speech is just as important as it ever was. So when it comes to asking people out on dates or managing your love life, husbands and wives, parents and children, people at work, giving speeches, getting along with your coworkers, speech is still the most important thing that we do. But if you look at our education system, in 12, 15, 20 years of education, everything we do is about reading and writing and doing math as if everything happens on paper. But this thing is actually the most important thing going on. So it's crazy to me that we don't learn anything about it. In 2010, I was doing an oral history about love, interviewing people from all over America talking about their experiences with love. And I interviewed my step-cousin Bill in rural Iowa, who was the family recluse. He basically lived in his parents' basement until he was 59 years old. And then he surprised everyone in the family by getting married. And so we were very curious for a long time, like, how did that happen? So when I was doing this book, I asked him about his experience, and the main thing I wanted to know was how did he break out of his isolation and talk to his future wife? And I completely expected that his answer would have something to do with psychiatry and having a doctor or somebody, a therapist, reach into his brain and talk about his childhood or the way that he deals with emotions. And what he said was, I joined the Toastmasters Club. And he gave a grand total of 6 speeches. And he said, and this is totally echoing Aristotle, he said, learning the basic principles of how to give a speech made me focus less on myself and my anxiety and more on the other person. And that was the first time I had ever heard any of this. So I started to research Toastmasters, and I found other stories of people who had had similar experiences. I met a prisoner from Louisiana who had been in jail for 28 years. And every time he went up for a parole hearing, he would mumble and blow it. And so they denied him parole. And he joined a prison Toastmasters chapter, and 7 months later, he was free. He was out of jail. I interviewed some famous Toastmasters like Tom Monahan, who founded Domino's Pizza, Debbie Fields Rose, who founded Mrs. Fields Cookies. And the word that all of them kept using was connection. And so I mused upon all of this. I just was in a muddle about it. What does this all mean? And eventually it kind of occurred to me that if you look at all the big problems in the world, all the political fighting and the alienation and the lack of civic engagement and people being down on the world and not talking to their neighbors, the common thread is disconnection. And so as obvious and simple as it seemed, I started to wonder, well, maybe the biggest problem in the world right now is that we no longer go to school and get trained in this art of connection. All around the world today, there are children struggling to speak up in classrooms. There are men and women who are no longer able to talk to each other because of this stuff. There are husbands and wives that need to learn how to get along better, and parents and children who, as always, could use some help learning how to talk better. In every country of the world, whether they are democratic or not, the world moves forward with people getting in groups and discussing among each other who should be president or what's the next best step for their society. Which brings us to our present moment and our special circumstances, which I won't name, which have prevented us from gathering in Paris and being in the same room and enjoying each other's presence. It would be very, 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 very easy to be discouraged about all of this if I weren't a member of a club which practices a superpower. A superpower which the Greeks actually thought was the secret to keeping the world moving together in a good direction. So I'm winding up the end of this talk and I have 3 takeaways, because you gotta have a takeaway. Number 1, I really would encourage everyone to check out these Greek principles and add them to your Toastmaster skill set, because they are dynamite. Number 2, I really would like people to geek out on this subject of ours and enjoy the fact and marvel at the fact that we are actually part of one of Western civilization's oldest traditions, intellectual tradition, artistic tradition. And number 3, somehow, like a religion, I would like to encourage us all to go out and spread the word. And every time I touch upon this, I feel crazy, so I'm going to cut to a quote of our founder once again, Ralph C. Smedley, who put it best for all of us. All civilization, all progress depends on communication of ideas. We are contributing to the improvement of society. Toastmasters International can be a powerful force for the improvement of world conditions. The world needs our services, and so does the whole world. Thank you very much. Back to you, International Director McGee.
Thank you, John. If you would like to purchase John's book, please visit the Toastmasters online store to secure your copy today. John has also provided some additional information that can be found in the Documents section below your viewing window. Please note that Toastmaster Bowe and all the education session speakers are excited to connect with you at their scheduled speaker showcase. Visit the agenda page for more details. John Bowe will be live to answer your questions on August 28th at 11:15 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Please take advantage of the opportunity to learn more.